Erie community is fascinating. It was large enough that there was the hope of multiple generations of continuation, of preservation, of the faith, of Russian identity, of the language, hopefully, and various aspects of culture. It was also concentrated. So unlike the mining towns south of Pittsburgh, where there are small pockets in Cokeburg and Mariana and Ellsworth, spread out over the train trek going south and terminating at Mariana, the community in Erie coalesced very quickly and very tightly. So the neighborhood itself is very compact, which then creates the environment for ideal preservation as well. It was also interesting that they came from a shared similar area. So not only were they very similar in practice, but also in genealogy, in shared history. So unlike some other communities in the United States, some other immigrant communities, which have come from all over Poland, and they create Polonia in Detroit or in Chicago, where people come from vastly different areas. The Erie Old Believers came from a relatively compact area, and so they have shared that history over centuries. Very few people knew names of villages, or they would say, oh yes, my father, my grandfather used to say that we were from this place. And I would fastidiously, as a linguist, write down what they had said and transcribe it. And I went to the atlases that I had access to and couldn't find any of these places other than Suwałki, and maybe in some of them they might have Sejny marked as well, but none of the village names. And it wasn't until I went to the map department, the map room at the Ohio State University main library, and they pulled out military grade maps from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that I started finding these villages and slowly was able to reconstruct the list of the villages that people came from. They originally arrived from the Pskov region, largely, and migrated into what is now eastern Lithuania, and settled there. They, in the 1690s, were fleeing as the Russian Empire was expanding, as Peter the Great moved the capital of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which suddenly became much closer to the Pskov region. And as persecutions intensified, as they were trying to either capture or kill or persecute, drag back, convert Old Believers in this area, many people fled away from that area and out of the Russian Empire. So there were actually decrees, much like a runaway slave act, to return Old Believers who had fled outside of the Russian Empire, or outside of Russia, and then it became the Russian Empire, to return them. And they kept expanding and extending and fleeing farther and farther away from that center of power. One of my favorite quotes is, "Peter's arm is long, but it won't reach us here." And that arm grew ever longer, and they kept fleeing. When they came into Lithuania and then settled their first population centers in Rusanova and Gudishki and Deguchi, and had concentration centers of Old Believer centers. As persecutions intensified, as the Russian Empire expanded into that region, they kept fleeing. and fled into what is now far northeastern Poland from the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, established their first villages, the villages that we now identify people coming from in the community here. And then in 1795, there was the third partition of Poland, which then gave that area back into Russian control. People had to again deal with the issue of trying to be either returned or converted. Some groups even fled into Prussia in the 1820s and 1830s, yet again outside of the Russian Empire, to try to find a safe place for them to live and practice their faith and maintain their identity as well. So yes, now most of the villages that people come from are now located in what I will always clarify as being present-day Poland and present-day Lithuania. Historically belong to radically different administrative, political units as well. So one big question to understand is why the Old Believers fled, why they were being persecuted. When the reforms were made, the Old Believers said, well, we've been doing this, we've been practicing, we are pravoslavные, we are Orthodox, we are correctly praising God, and this is the way that our parents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents have been doing it for centuries. And you can't just make us change. And the Patriarch and Tsar said, yeah, we can. And that led to the persecutions, either forcing them to try to reform, try to adopt the reforms. But as a matter of conscience, they said, we just can't do this, and they fled. And this is not a small number. There are hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people who were refusing to go along with the reforms, and especially if they were in smaller villages where the reforms took a while to trickle down to the people. It might not have become an issue for years or decades even. To go against, as this is exactly the time when the Russian Empire arrives, and for a large group of the population to reject the authority, both the religious authority and the secular authority of the Russian Empire was very dangerous. And they were very often captured, arrested, imprisoned, killed for maintaining their faith. And so it was something that was worth fighting for, and they fled. And then they were pursued as well by government troops, mostly unsuccessfully. The Old Believers always found holes in the borders, always were able to stay a couple of steps ahead of the law, but they continued to have to move. And at the same time, the Russian Empire continued to expand, and every time they went past that border, suddenly, several decades later, the border would shift again, and they would fall under the new rules. It severely hampered the way that Old Believers were able to practice their religion and live their lives as well. So it affected everything. And for many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just in this region alone who were challenging the authority of the Russian Empire, it was a dangerous move, was deemed as something which should be put down. And if the government couldn't persecute or capture, imprison, drag back to Russia, they then also waged campaigns of trying to convert people to Единоверие, to say, you can have your practices, we're still going to make some changes, and you have to report to our hierarchy, was another thing that the Old Believers in this area wouldn't tolerate. So if you look and successfully find Suwałki on a map, it is in the far northeastern corner of Poland, very far from the Atlantic Ocean and the places where steamships left. Most of the Old Believers, based on my research through Ellis Island records, naturalization records, immigration records, citizenship papers, and things like that, people would identify in those golden documents the villages that they came from, and then also the immigration records would say the port that they sailed from. So the vast majority of people came through Hamburg and some through Bremen as well, both in Germany. Sailing to the United States. So these were German steamship passenger lines that served the east coast of the United States. So they would leave from Hamburg and Bremen. A few came through Rotterdam and Amsterdam, Libau, Liepaja in Latvia, but the vast majority were coming through Hamburg and Bremen. That's still a very long distance. And it was passing a governmental boundary. So we're talking now about the 1880s up until 1914. Again, that area was unstable. And the boundaries had been shifting. Some of the Old Believers in that area were in an area controlled by the Russian Empire, and those to the west were in East Prussia, controlled by Germany. What people were then doing is probably, I haven't been able to find anyone who had memories of how they got from their village to the ports in Germany. But I've been able to reconstruct the most likely route. So people would probably have taken either a cart, horses, or maybe the train to one of the 10 or so control stations that were on the border between Russia and Germany at that point. And the closest one to our region is Prostki in Poland. So that was about 30 to 40 miles for most people. And so they would arrive at a control station, would be inspected for diseases. If necessary, one of the descriptions was people aren't normally bathed unless they want to be or are so filthy that they can't have a successful health inspection of them. Knowing the Russian Old Believers and their practice of banya, I don't think that was necessarily a problem. But people could also have their belongings disinfected. They would get onto a train once there were enough people to fill a train. There was a sealed train that would go from the control station, usually through Berlin, through Holdeman, where there would be another inspection, and then on to the port cities. So they very often had to have a prepaid ticket or a voucher that said that they had paid their way all the way to their destination point in the United States, not just to the port, but actually on to Mariana or to Erie. That trip from the control station to the port took usually about 24 hours. So between inspection to getting to the port, and then once they were at the port, they would wait for a ship to have enough passengers to fill that up, to then sail to the United States. So they might then be under medical observation for 2 to 7 days or so total to make sure, because the German shipping companies didn't want to admit anyone who was going to be sick, who was going to be rejected by the American ports, because they would then be sent back to Europe at the expense of the German company. So it was in everybody's best interest that everyone was healthy and made that process. So that was then by train that they would go, sealed passenger train from the control center through Berlin up to the ports in Hamburg. In the very earliest sailings from the 1880s that Erie Old Believers made, that trip could be 11, 12, 13 days. And toward the end, up to 1914, because of better processing and better technology, sailing technology, that trip was often 7, 8, 9 days. So again, the less time you spend on a ship with a whole bunch of people, the more likely you are to be healthy when you arrive as well. They were then processed after 1892 when Ellis Island opened. The vast majority were then processed through Ellis Island in New York. Before Ellis Island opened, people came through Philadelphia and through Baltimore. So I have examples, even after Ellis Island had opened, that people came through Philadelphia and Baltimore. Again, these are well-connected railroad, connected to the railroad to where they could then make it to Pittsburgh, to the mines, or up to Erie as well by train after that. And they were able to make that journey then in probably 2 weeks or so, under 2 weeks from leaving home in Suwałki to arriving in the United States. The first wave was single young men of working age. They came, they usually worked for a couple of years, made enough money then to establish themselves here and also make the trip back and have enough money to then be able to bring people back. So it's popular now in the news to talk about chain migration, and Erie, the Erie Old Believer community is exactly chain migration. People came over, went back and said, hey, there's really good work, things are stable, there are other Russians there that we can speak Russian with, there are other Poles there that we can speak Polish with, there are other Lithuanians there who we can speak Lithuanian with. Their communities are coalescing, they're able to set up a small church somewhere and practice their religion. There's Orthodoxy there, so we're no longer the only Orthodox in the neighborhood. And there were more reasons to be able to make a successful life. And then we soon see people coming over with families, men with their wives and young children as well. So it was then possible to create a community and then to start praying in people's homes and then to have enough people making enough money to be able to build a church, to say we've got enough critical mass here to be able to have a congregation. And then that eventually happened in 1919 when there was enough. Mariana was 10 years before because so many of the workers went down into the mines and then chose Erie because of work, of safer work, of cleaner work. Another great pull, I wish everyone could go and visit Suwałki in this area because it is just like Erie. Forests and streams and lakes, rolling hills, beautiful nature, berries and mushrooms and fish, everything that they needed to sustain themselves back in the old country was also here. The climate is similar, maybe more snow here from time to time, but the overall experience, to have neighbors who are also Polish and also Orthodox, and communities tolerating each other and being a part of this tossed salad, this mixed salad, which was this massive migration from Central and Eastern Europe up until 1914 as well. Our first burials happened in 1918. That's when the cemetery is purchased. That's a big commitment to say, we're going to create a cemetery to bury people permanently here. Old Believers who became U.S. citizens, so many Old Believers who fought in World War I in Germany where their relatives were. It was outstanding. These are the foreign-born people who had been in the country not very long, serving in the U.S. military, to fight in World War I. And of course, that number soars in World War II as well. What happened with 1914, with the outbreak of World War I, is that all immigration stopped. And it didn't resume until 1918, 1919, so we have a couple of people who are trailing in. Then the United States passes immigration quotas in the early 1920s that severely curtailed immigration, especially from this area and especially with Slavic groups like Russians. There was still continued migration to families. So if your family was already over, then you got a pass and you were able to come over and join families. But by and large, almost all of the immigration stops from that region to the United States by the early 1920s. Old believers are still leaving that area, and then you have old believers going to places like South America and to Canada. And so there are old believers all over those other areas in the world, other places which had migration patterns as well. So there's the introduction from the passport. Once people start working here, you can then see the Americanization process of last names. Very quickly, many people adopt the OFF ending for anything that has a sound at the end of it. So we then get Legenzov spelled OFF and Popov spelled OFF. Some people chose to drop the OFF part, so Pantsirev becomes Panzer and Penser, just dropping off that. Legenzov, already being challenging enough to spell, gets everything dropped and leaves a form that is similar to an American name, and you get Lee. And so now you have people of the same families who have two different spellings of their names. That's very common in Erie, especially in the earlier years. But once you started having children and getting your records in the census and getting your names in city directories and getting pay stubs and bank accounts and mortgages, people's names solidified and stuck. It's possible to get your name changed. Some people did. Some people one of the last steps in the naturalization process is, would you like to legally change your name right now? Now that we've got you in the office, would you like to change your name as well? All of the immigration records have to say, what was the name on the manifest of the ship that you came over, the spelling and the date and everything. And then what other forms has your name appeared in? And then also, would you like to change your name? So there's actually a breadcrumb trail of being able to establish people's names. And so that's one of my favorite hobbies, academic hobbies, is to establish what people's names were. So there are a lot of spellings that came from other languages that were used in passports. So again, that influence of Polish and German was very strong. Pantsirev, you might be wondering why there's a C in that name. Well, that C is the Polish spelling of the TS sound. So there are many leftovers. Why is there a W in Wassel? And what happened to the rest of that name? Was that Vasiliev or Vasilievsky? Which in a lot of cases it was. That W comes from that spelling of from Polish and German. That double S either came from German to get an S sound as opposed to a Z sound, you double the S, or when people wrote their name out, it would get repronounced, and then people would write down what they thought they were hearing. So Ivanov becomes Evanov, and you can imagine that Ivanov, that E, is like E. Okay, well, let's start and write the letter E, and then VAN, and then OFF, that's what everybody's name gets. And you can get that shift from the E sound to the E sound. Dropping the OFF leaves you with Evan, and that begs that S that comes back in from so many names of European origin, Anders, son of Ander. And so you'll get forms like Evans, formed from Ivanov. So many of the names that end in an S, you can replace with that OFF or OV and start reconstructing what that name originally was. There were other instances. Alexeyev becomes Alex. There were, if there was an American name or an immigrant name that was close, it drew like a magnet some of those names. So the Scottish and Irish names that were popular in western Pennsylvania that begin with Mick suddenly pull all of the Russian Old Believer names. So Mikitin becomes Mik-Keaton, and Makedonsky becomes Mekdonsky and Mekdonson. Mikinin becomes Mikkinen. So that's this extra layer of Americanization where it's actually Americanizing to a foreign origin name, which is also interesting. And then there are times when people's names changed radically. You'll often see stories of like, oh yeah, well, somebody died and they said, well, if you want this job, you have to be Joe Smith from now on. And I don't know how much of that is actually true. There are Smiths who come from Kovalyov, which means blacksmith. And so there were a couple of examples of people who translated, not just transliterated, but translated their names into English. So a handful of those. And then there's some that are just absolutely completely different. So to meet Frank and Cora Alex, you would never know that their last name is Shilingovsky. And there's still Shilingovskys in the records in Suwałki as well. So there are a lot of names that Pantsirev, that's a difficult name to begin with, to become an Evans. Is also hard to guess. There are a couple of instances where a person has taken their patronymic and formed their last names. So they might be Alexeyevich, son of Alexei, and that Alexeyevich becomes their new name. Another interesting linguistic thing is that we think of Russian names as Ovich and Ovna, son or daughter of the father. And actually in this area in Suwałki, the patronymics are Ev and Eva. And so they look like last names when they're actually hiding a patronymic and another name that comes. So I've worked through the church records for a very long time, identifying people, and that's one of the things from the Erie birth and death and marriage records that I've been able to establish is what people's names actually were based on who they were married to or the children who they gave birth to or their age or their death. I've been able to slowly reconstruct where some of those names are. But I recommend to everyone to go up to the Hannon Road Cemetery and wander around and appreciate the variety of names. So the children then had to live American lives. The boundaries of restrictions on having contact with non-Old Believers, especially after the first nastavniki who are very strict, open them up to more access to marrying other people. And then, of course, once you marry someone from another language, Russian loses out in the home. It was a perfect storm of reasons why the Old Believers lost their language and lost it so quickly. And then also the restrictions against interacting with non-Old Believers was still maintained, but not nearly as strict. So there were still, in the United States, nastavniki who said, don't go, you can have Catholic friends, but definitely don't date them, definitely don't marry them, and also don't go into their churches and don't pray with them as well. And that was something which with the later generations of nastavniki in Erie, that laxing occurred. The fact that pomorci were allowed to be around other old believers, and maybe even having people who weren't old believers who were there when they were having prayers. Many of those things laxed, which then aided the acculturation, that full participation in American life in the United States. It made it much easier to have those interactions. The very earliest nastavniki were still battling. The first two nastavniki were still foreign-born, and it wasn't until Father Yakov, who was our first U.S.-born nastavnik, that things really began to change.